The sun was merciless over the South Dakota capital. A hush fell over the crowd as armored vehicles idled at the edge of the plaza. Inside the towering white stone building, Kristi Noem stood before the cameras, her voice crisp and commanding. "This is not just about security, it's about protecting our nation from those who defy our values." She didn't say his name yet, but everyone knew. Just hours earlier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had landed in the U.S. under diplomatic invitation to speak at a global security summit. His popularity had soared not just across Africa, but among students, activists, and workers around the world. He was young, disciplined, and dangerously charismatic, especially to those who preferred Africa silent. Noem, branding herself as the guardian of American sovereignty, called an emergency press conference in response. Her speech began with a calm resolve. But something in her voice betrayed fear, not of Traoré as a threat, but of the movement he carried with him. "Ibrahim Traoré is not here to build bridges," she claimed. "He's here to test how far we'll bend before we break." Outside, hundreds had gathered, many expecting tension, some hoping for dialogue. American flags waved beside African ones. Protesters held signs, "Let Africa breathe. You fear what you can't control. Traoré speaks. We listen." The mood shifted when a black SUV pulled into the barricaded perimeter. The doors opened. Ibrahim Traoré emerged in a plain olive jacket. No bodyguards. No entourage. Just a leather folder under his arm. His presence ignited the crowd. Chants erupted. Traoré, Traoré. From a window above, Noem watched. Her eyes narrowed. Then she turned to her security chief and uttered the 6 words that would ripple across headlines worldwide. "Arrest him. Do it now." What she didn't expect was what the crowd would do next. Noem's words weren't whispered, they were declared. Her voice, sharp as glass, sliced through the silence in the command center. The officers hesitated. For a second, you could hear nothing but the humming of the live broadcast equipment and the distant roar of the crowd below. "Madam Governor," her chief of security replied cautiously, "he's here on diplomatic grounds. This could escalate." "I said arrest him," Noem snapped, her eyes never leaving the screen that showed Traoré calmly approaching the steps. "He's not here to negotiate. He's here to provoke." Outside, the crowd was swelling. Traoré had reached the first step of the Capitol, walking as if the weight of centuries moved with him. His eyes scanned the scene, the snipers on the roof, the soldiers shifting nervously, the barricades designed not to protect, but to separate. And yet, he looked undisturbed, resolved. He raised his hand. The crowd hushed instantly. Then, he spoke, not into a microphone, but directly, with his voice elevated not by technology, but by fire. "I did not come to challenge America. I came to challenge her fear." The word struck harder than any accusation. A woman in the crowd began to cry. A veteran lowered his flag, not out of shame, but contemplation. Noem's eyes flickered. Even she felt it, the shift in atmosphere. That's when the security detail began moving. A group of 6 agents, dressed in tactical black, pushed through the barrier. The crowd tensed. Murmurs grew louder. People raised their phones. Some began shouting, "He's a guest. This is not democracy. Let him speak." But the agents moved forward. Traoré stood his ground. His hands never left his sides. He didn't blink. Then, something unexpected. An elderly white woman stepped in front of him. Then a young black student beside her. A construction worker. A veteran. A nurse in uniform. One by one, they formed a human wall between Traoré and the agents. The crowd was no longer an audience. It had become a shield, and inside the Capitol, Noem's composure cracked. The line between authority and the people blurred in an instant. 6 agents. Unflinching, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. Dozens of civilians. Unarmed, untrained, but immovable. A college student held up a cardboard sign scrawled in black marker. "You can arrest a man, but not a movement." A hush fell again. The agents paused just feet from the human wall. Their comms buzzed in their ears. Noem's voice came through. "What are you waiting for? Push through." But hesitation had taken root. One agent's hand faltered near his sidearm. He looked not at Traoré, but at the nurse standing in front of him, her arms crossed, eyes steady. She wore her hospital badge. "You gonna arrest me too?" she asked. In that moment, the agents realized, any force used here wouldn't just touch Traoré, it would ripple across every screen, every headline, every soul watching. And there were millions watching. Inside the capital, Kristi Noem paced like a general losing a battle she never prepared for. "This isn't how it's supposed to go," she muttered. Her chief of staff replied quietly, "Ma'am, you've just made him a martyr, and he hasn't even spoken yet." Back outside, Traoré took a step forward, not to challenge, but to stand in the silence. Then he lifted his voice again. "You call this Homeland Security. I call it fear in uniform. But know this, I will not fear you, and I will not run." The crowd erupted. But not in chaos, in unity. They began chanting, "We are not your colonies. Let him speak. Let Africa speak." And then, a miracle of resistance. The agent stepped back. It wasn't an order. It wasn't weakness. It was the first sign that power was shifting, not from governments, but from those once voiceless, who now had someone standing for them. Traoré didn't gloat. He simply nodded, then looked up at the Capitol steps. He was going in, not as an invader, but as an equal. And Kristi Noem was waiting. The heavy oak doors of the South Dakota Capitol opened with a slow creak that sounded more like a warning than a welcome. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered above polished marble floors. The building was quiet, eerily so. But the tension pulsed like electricity through the walls. Traoré walked alone down the main corridor, the echo of his boots deliberate, unhurried. Portraits of past governors lined the hall, all of them white, all of them men. He didn't glance at them. His eyes were locked ahead, on the chamber where Kristi Noem waited with arms crossed, surrounded by her security and advisors. He entered. Noem didn't speak at first. Her jaw was clenched, her posture rigid. She was used to controlling the narrative, especially on her own soil, but the man standing before her had just turned her authority into a global meme. Twitter was flooded. Hashtags like #LetTraoré and #ThePeople shielded him were already trending worldwide. Finally, she spoke. "What is your endgame, Captain? You want attention? You've got it." Traoré didn't flinch. "I want truth. I want the West to stop pretending that African lives are projects, that our nations are security threats simply for standing upright." Her voice grew sharper. "You don't understand what this country is built on." "Correction," he said calmly. "It was built on stolen labor, stolen land, and fear disguised as freedom." The room froze. Even her own staff looked uncomfortable. But Noem pushed on, doubling down. "You stand on American soil because we allowed it. Don't mistake that for equality." That was it. Traoré took a slow step forward, then placed his folder gently on the nearest desk. He opened it, revealing documents, maps, photos, lists, of U.S. military installations, covert operations, and economic contracts exploiting African resources under the banner of stability. "You didn't allow me," he said quietly. "You invited me. And now that I'm here, I'm going to show your people what they've never been told." Noem's hand trembled. Not because she feared violence, but because she feared the story he was about to unleash. And outside, the crowd was still chanting. The room was silent, but the air was on fire. Every document Traoré laid out on the desk carried the weight of history, a truth buried under decades of redacted reports, classified missions, and carefully sanitized speeches. Now, it was exposed beneath the cold fluorescent lights of an American statehouse. A map detailed the network of U.S. military outposts scattered across Africa. Not for peacekeeping, but for resource control: lithium mines in Congo, uranium fields in Niger, gold in Burkina Faso. Another folder listed names: African leaders ousted or assassinated after rejecting Western contracts. Some names had American code words scribbled beside them. Operation Tether, one read. Resource Stabilization Protocol, said another. Noem glanced down at the files but refused to acknowledge them. "These are just papers," she said flatly. Traoré's voice deepened. "No. These are receipts." He turned toward the small camera set up at the edge of the room. A live broadcast was streaming everything to the crowd outside and to millions online. "The West doesn't fear violence," he said into the lens. "It fears accountability." The broadcast crackled briefly, as if someone tried to cut it. But it held. One of Noem's advisors stepped forward, whispering urgently. "Madam Governor, this is going global. The live stream is trending on every platform. Even lawmakers in D.C. are watching." Noem waved him off. But her face was pale. The power had shifted. "You came here unarmed," she said slowly, "but you're trying to start a war." "No," Traoré replied, "I'm ending one." He closed the folder and slid it toward her across the desk. "You can arrest me if it makes you feel in control. But the people outside, and across the world, already heard me. You can't arrest what they now know." Outside, the chants had shifted again. Louder. Stronger. "We see you. We hear Africa." Inside, Noem looked down at the folder, then up at Traoré. "What exactly is your goal?" Traoré smiled, not smugly, but like a man who had nothing left to lose. "Liberation. Not just of Africa, but of truth itself." And in that moment, even her silence became his victory. Kristi Noem didn't respond. Not immediately. She sat in that high-backed leather chair, staring down at the folder Traoré had left in front of her, a physical symbol of everything the West had tried to keep abstract. Resources. Contracts. Regime changes. All documented. All public now. The crowd outside had swelled to the thousands. Journalists with cameras, veterans in uniform, college students with homemade signs. From California to Kinshasa, from Dakar to Detroit, the stream of Traoré's confrontation played on loop. In Washington, aides briefed senators. "You're going to want to see this. It's not just about South Dakota anymore." Back in the Capitol room, Noem finally broke the silence. "You think people will side with you?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "That they'll abandon their country for a man who's not even American?" Traoré stepped closer. Not threateningly, but with the calm force of truth. "I don't need them to abandon their country," he said. "I need them to reclaim their conscience." He glanced toward the camera again. "Not to grandstand, but to witness. Your country cannot lead the world by force. It must lead by example. But for too long, it's exported fear in the name of freedom. You fund wars and call it stability. You extract resources and call it aid." Noem looked around the room, none of her aides met her gaze. Even they were beginning to listen. A ping from her phone buzzed loudly in the quiet chamber. She picked it up, a message from a major U.S. network. "Madam Governor, we are requesting comment on the allegations presented by President Traoré." Another message. Then another. And another. Her entire feed was drowning in footage of the confrontation. Hashtags like #AfricaSpeaks and #Traoré vs Noem exploded in global trending lists. Meanwhile, outside, something extraordinary happened. A group of U.S. veterans, some wearing medals, others with prosthetic limbs, walked toward the Capitol steps. They didn't chant. They didn't raise fists. They simply stood in silence, facing the building, hands on hearts. One of them whispered to a reporter. "That man reminds me why I served in the first place." Inside, Noem finally exhaled. For the first time, she understood. She had tried to arrest a man, and awakened a movement. The South Dakota state capitol hadn't seen this many cameras since its foundation stone was laid. Dozens of media outlets, national and international, set up their equipment on the lawn. Drones hovered above. Satellite trucks beeped in reverse as cables snaked across the grass. Anchors rehearsed their lines. The world wasn't just watching anymore, it was leaning in. And at the center of it all, a single podium. It didn't have an American flag. Or any flag. Just a mic. The crowd surged as Traoré emerged from the building, flanked not by security, but by citizens. A nurse, a schoolteacher, a Vietnam vet, a local rancher. Faces of America, standing behind a face from Africa. Kristi Noem had refused to hold a press conference of her own. Her office issued a bland statement. Governor Noem supports open dialogue and lawful order. But everyone knew that meant, she had lost the narrative. Traoré stepped to the microphone. I did not come here to make war with America, he began. I came because America keeps making war with Africa, quietly, economically, systematically. The air tensed. You say you bring democracy. But you sign deals behind closed doors. You say you bring peace. But you leave boots and bases on our soil. And when we rise, not with bullets, but with voices, you send your governors to silence us. His voice didn't rise. But his presence did. But look around, he said, gesturing to the crowd. Look beyond this capital. Beyond this country. People are waking up. They are not yours. And they are not mine. They are free, and finally, they know it. Journalists fired questions. Microphones surged forward. A CNN reporter shouted, Mr. President, are you suggesting the U.S. should withdraw from Africa? Traoré turned to her calmly. I am not suggesting. I am promising, we will no longer be your stepping stone. We are a continent, not a colony. The crowd roared. Even in cities like Atlanta, Paris, Nairobi, and London, viewers stood up from couches and clapped like they were there. The speech wasn't political. It was seismic. Inside the Capitol, Noem watched from a private screen. Her expression blank. Her influence, cracked. And on that lawn, a new narrative was born, not one dictated by statecraft, but by truth in full volume. Within hours of Traoré's speech, the echoes hit Washington like a shockwave. Inside the West Wing, advisors scrambled to update the president. A special intelligence briefing was hastily scheduled. Pentagon officials were already running damage control, leaking statements to the press, trying to portray Traoré's words as emotionally charged rather than strategically disruptive. But the numbers didn't lie. Polls showed a staggering 71% of young Americans supported Traoré's stance on ending U.S. military involvement in Africa. Even older demographics, veterans, civil rights groups, faith-based organizations, were voicing cautious admiration for his courage. And while American officials debated optics, Africa was moving. Leaders from Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, and Namibia held emergency calls. The African Union issued a public letter supporting President Traoré's right to speak freely and defend African sovereignty against neo-colonial encroachment. But perhaps most surprising was the voice that came next. Former President Barack Obama, during a university town hall, was asked about Traoré. He paused. Thought carefully. Then said, when young leaders stand for dignity, even if they speak against our policies, we should listen. Not because we agree, but because truth should never fear the microphone. The auditorium exploded in applause. Meanwhile, Kristi Noem's approval ratings dropped like a stone. The hashtag Traoré taught us became a rallying cry on college campuses. Protest murals with his face began appearing in Oakland, Chicago, and even rural Iowa. At the same time, a leaked audio file from inside Noem's office surfaced, a panicked conversation between her and a Defense Department liaison. You need to shut him down, she snapped. He's igniting something we can't control. The voice on the other end hesitated. With all due respect, Governor, it may be too late. Traoré, unaware of the chaos erupting across American political circles, was on a chartered plane back to Ouagadougou. But before boarding, he recorded one final message. "This was never about me. It's about who speaks when the world goes silent. And who dares to listen." It was brief. But it hit like thunder. The footage of Traoré's press conference became one of the most shared videos in global history, translated into 42 languages, viewed over 800 million times in just 1 week. In South Africa, students marched with placards. "Traoré speaks, we echo." In France, protesters outside the National Assembly chanted, "Africa is not your minefield." In the U.S., young voters began calling senators, demanding hearings on African policy and military funding. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré didn't bask in the spotlight. He went straight to work. Within days, he convened an emergency summit in Ouagadougou. Leaders from 12 African nations arrived, not in luxury motorcades, but in modest convoys. The agenda was clear. How do we dismantle neo-colonial control without triggering economic collapse? Experts in African finance, agriculture, education, and energy shared ideas. Some proposed a new Pan-African trade alliance. Others suggested a continental satellite internet system, independent of Western infrastructure. Traoré listened, and then offered his vision. "Let them cut our aid," he said. "Let them withdraw their companies. Let them threaten sanctions. If they leave, we learn to stand. If they stay, we demand fair terms." The room erupted. Not in applause, in purpose. And just when global leaders thought Traoré had reached his peak, another shock came. Brazil's president released a statement praising Traoré's honest leadership. Then Indonesia, then Bolivia. A global South coalition was forming, and at its heart stood a young captain from West Africa. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., Noem faced internal revolt. Several staffers resigned, citing moral conflict. A leaked memo from her office revealed a secret plan to bar Traoré from re-entering the U.S., branding him a foreign agitator. But it was too late. American civil society had turned. Black leaders, veterans, professors, climate activists, all saw in Traoré a rare blend of truth and courage. Something Washington hadn't produced in decades. And in the most unexpected twist, the National Cathedral in D.C. announced they would host a public interfaith prayer service. For peace between Africa and America, and in gratitude for voices that speak when silence is easier. It was sunset in Ouagadougou. The streets were quiet, not from fear, but from reflection. Across rooftops, radios softly played recordings of Traoré's words. In schools, teachers paused lessons to explain what had happened. In village markets, farmers spoke of policy like poets. They had seen one of their own stand before the world and not flinch. Inside the modest presidential palace, Traoré sat with a stack of letters. Some were from heads of state. But many, most, were from ordinary people. A teenager in Detroit wrote, "You made me proud to be black and bold." A veteran from Texas. "You reminded me why I wore the uniform in the first place." A woman from Gaza. "When the bombs fall silent, your voice still echoes." Traoré closed his eyes. He hadn't set out to be a symbol. He just refused to be silent. Suddenly, a soft knock. His aide entered with cautious urgency. "Mr. President," she said, "you've been invited to speak, not at a conference. Not at a forum. At the United Nations General Assembly. Again. This time, they're asking you to close the session." Traoré smiled, not with pride, but with gravity. They finally want to listen. Not debate. Not defend. Just, listen. Outside, the world moved. Kristi Noem quietly withdrew from public life weeks later, citing the need for healing. Her political career, once soaring, had crumbled under the weight of a single sentence, not hers, but Traoré's. You cannot arrest a movement whose time has come. The phrase was now etched in graffiti on walls in Johannesburg, tattooed on shoulders in Brooklyn, and whispered in refugee camps in Sudan. Back at the palace, Traoré looked out at the horizon. A continent, once plundered and pitted, was now rising, not in anger, but in agency. And the world? The world was watching, yes. But more importantly, it was listening.